name is David Keane. I am the co-founder and head of DevOps at Calitii. But before that, I worked for about 25 years in lots of large organizations, Deutsche Bank, UBS, JP Morgan, and then most recently at HSBC for about 12 years or so. I had two major roles at HSBC. I ran a agile and DevOps transformation for the investment bank, and then more recently I was the global head of DevOps transformation for the entire enterprise. But why am I here inflicting myself on you good people? Actually about 7 years ago I attended a summit quite similar to this, that my clock isn't counting down, I could stay here forever. I attended a event quite similar to this myself about 7 years ago. I think it was a DevOps Enterprise Summit. And I remember seeing people speaking at that and being quite reassured, actually. My God, I wasn't alone. There was other people who were trying to handle this madness and this craziness. So I found that a really useful exercise. And so I hope there's something useful that comes from this. Even if just for one of you that I have to tell. So in my role at HSBC, obviously in front of responsible for a very large transformation across 50,000 people in technology, but also subsequently in the role that I now have, where I meet lots of enterprises. Everyone's got a different context, a different starting place, their own complexities. But there's some challenges that you hear again and again, right? And one of those that never ceases to surprise me is that of purpose, right? So why are we doing this? What are we trying to do? How do we know if we're getting any better? I remember one CIO I met said that he wanted to create the most awesome IT organization on the planet. And you can't fault him for ambition, right? But it's pretty hard to put KPIs around that. So what do you do? How do you establish that purpose? Establish that purpose is incredibly important. Once you have established purpose, you find out pretty quickly that there's lots of reasons you can't do it. There's lots of blockers, right? And the one I'm going to focus on today is around IT controls. Why? Because for us at HSBC, it was front and center. It was always the number one thing that was called out. Why can't we evolve? Why can't we change? Well, we've got IT controls and they won't let us. And it's a fairly often repeated issue with anybody in the regulated industry in particular. So just to give you a little bit of context, right? I'm sure most of you know HSBC. It's a very large organization. I think it's 250,000 or so people. There's 50 countries in the world that have more or less citizens than HSBC has staff. It's present in about 74 countries. There's about 50,000 people in tech. And when you're in 74 countries, you're regulated by 74 different regulators, obviously, also, which adds to the complexity. And like any organization that size, there's different silos. In HSBC, we had a retail bank, wealth bank, commercial bank, investment bank. And then you have all the central things like finance and HR and so on and so forth. You have all those complexities. If you go back to sort of 2014, where I started this story, the idea of agile was already pretty well established, right? But DevOps was a new kid in the block, right? Everybody was excited about DevOps. And across an organization of 50,000 people, of course, there's lots of different people who are trying to do different things, who are trying to do something different to improve their situation. But I'm going to start the story with one particular group, because their experiments really proved foundational for what we later did with the entire organization. That group was a relatively small team, so one application, about 100 people, and they were responsible for a system called FX Evolve. So FX Evolve's job was foreign exchange for multinationals, for huge corporates. So it's not like you and me, if we need to change 100 quid into 110 euros or whatever it's going to be. This is a multi-billion-dollar trading platform, for very, very important for the bank. It needs to be available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And the relationship between the business and IT was fairly typical. And what I mean by that, it wasn't great. It was a fairly strained relationship between IT and the business. And And so what happened in sort of September, October time 2014 was there was a bit of a disaster, right? The system went down for 2 days. Had it been down for an hour or 2 hours, I think the usual kind of stuff would have happened. There'd been lots of shouting and screaming. People would have been threatened to lose their jobs, but we would have returned to business as normal. But desperate times, desperate measures. So the business and IT decided to sit down and actually talk to each other. It was kind of a new thing to do. And the business gave the tech guys, to give you a couple of months to pare down your technical debt and what have you. But pretty quickly they agreed that one of the things that they wanted to do, one of the things that they wanted to change, was they wanted to start releasing more frequently into production. Right? They were inspired, I think, by the state of DevOps reports, Accelerate, and so on, and so forth. Now, I won't be able to do justice in the time we have today all the things that they did. They're all pretty obvious things, version controlling. They automated those things that made sense. They elevated those things that they couldn't automate. Further down, they moved to microservice. They changed things greatly. But one of the fundamental things they did at the very, very start was to look at their own setup within the technology group. And they were very traditionally structured. You had a development team sat over here. You had a support team over there. You had two people who were doing deployments. They were the only people who could do deployments. You had a group of BAs, management, all quite separate, all different silos. And they decided that they needed to change that. And one of it was this logjam they had around deployments, just two people. And the changes were big and complex. So if one of those people was out, essentially you couldn't do any change. And this didn't go down that well with everybody. Everybody had to do support. And some of the developers felt that doing support was beneath them, right? And so they were thanked for their contribution today, but generally encouraged to go somewhere else. So pretty quickly within that organization, people started breaking down those silos and taking on different responsibilities. And because they were genuinely applying, the principles of Agile and the discipline that comes with DevOps, as they started to accelerate, all those things that were automated and improved meant that their quality improved, and their release frequency didn't have the characteristic that I had grown used to, right? I don't know what the worst day of my career was, but I can tell you it was a Monday. Why was it a Monday? Because all the changes go in on a Friday, and on Monday morning you discover they didn't work as well as you were told to expect. So that's why this graph is so important, right? Because not only does it show that we were able to break that very tight correlation between change and incident, but we actually sent it into reverse, right? So the blue line here is the number of changes that the team does on a monthly basis. The red line is the number of incidents. It's just one application, right? And you can see early on you have a relatively tight correlation between incident and change, but it breaks here. And now the more frequently that they release, their incidents are actually going down. As somebody, again, who's experienced the opposite, if somebody told me at the start that what you needed to do to increase your stability was to increase your change, I'd have found that really, really hard to believe. So our mantra became go faster, break less. So we proved it for one application, just one application, but with all the HSBC headwinds that they're going to have. It was super important because those who were in a guardian type role, be it a ITSM or a cyber or a quality gate type of role, were needed to be convinced. The developers are often viewed as the enemy and needed to be controlled. Here was a whole new paradigm. This proved the theory, right? But what do you do when you try and move that simple idea from a small group to enterprise-wide? And this is where it can go a little bit crazy, right? It falls down a little bit. You hear lots of objections. We can't do it because we're special, or we're old, or we're broken, or our business doesn't want to do it, or we've already done it. We're completely DevOps, or we're completely Agile. It might have worked over there, but it's not going to work for us. And you get lots of resistance, or you get lots of different ideas that are competing, and people are doing things in isolation. But they stay in isolation. They don't have an effect on the enterprise. And this is why it's so important for us to find purpose, right? Now, not everybody agreed, but the visibility, pretty much everybody knows what an incident and it changes. And also critically, we had visibility on those things. So we weren't trying to capture 100 metrics, we were just trying to capture 2. Now, while some people, many people, were resistant, if you like, to begin with, or didn't think it was going to change the dial, at least they knew what the numbers were. At least they could figure out in their own environment what they could do about it. So we had that ability to make it visible to everybody. One of the things that we did as we moved towards the want to do this for the investment bank. So the idea that we developed with FX Evolve, we expanded just to the applications that were sitting around it, right, in the FX department. But now we want to take it much broader. So the investment bank as a whole, we took this on. So the investment bank is about 1,000 applications. It's about 6,000 people, and again, you've lots of different silos within that, who don't particularly speak to each other a lot. We have to double down on our go faster and break less measure. And we decided to go for double and half, right? You have to double your release frequency every year, each year and every year, and have your incidents. Now, when people first heard that, they thought it was a ridiculous request. There's a few really important caveats that come with it. One was, it was an OKR, not a target. But it forced you to be ambitious, right? Because before that, if you were trying to improve by 5% to 10%, and you had 10 releases a year or 12 releases a year, it's not that hard to get a 13th or a 14th out. If you tell people they have to double and they have to tackle some of their really fundamental challenges that they have. The second thing was we made it multi-year. So it wasn't going to go away in 1 year. And I remember meeting teams afterwards in year 3 and 4 and said, Dave, you know, when this double and half thing came out, we just said we'd ignore it. You know, it'll be gone next year. It's this year's management fad. It's been going for 6 or 7 years in the investment bank now. And so in years 2 and 3, people realize this is something that isn't going to go away. I have to start taking it seriously. It's an OKR, but I'm going to be judged against it. But how would we judge them? Now, in a department this size with about 1,000 applications, so at a sub-department level, you might have 20 or 30 or 40 applications that you're responsible for. And it's at that level that we wanted to see the double and halving happen, right? We didn't mind if you had an application in your suite that you wanted to flatline and you wanted to quadruple on another one. As long as over the average you were doubling and halving, that was satisfactory. At a team level, we didn't want people to be judged, you know, if you're in charge of a legacy mainframe type system and you're doing a release once a month, it's unfair to compare that against an organization that might be using the latest technologies and it's just a greenfield side. So you're compared against your history, right? So we came up with this idea of a production deployment for a 10-person team. And the metric, the blue line here that you see is slightly different to the one on the previous page. This talks about the release frequency on a monthly basis for a notional team of 10, right? That allowed us to make a valid comparison across the different parts of the organization. The reds are still incidents, and you can see that we've seen the same pattern. You can see this very positive jaws thing appearing as the release frequency increases and the incidents start tailing off. One of the other things that we did was to make everything very transparent. And in the initial days, what that meant was we put big A3 sized pieces of paper up every month on the walls of every office that we had IT staff, and we had the kind of the scores there. And I remember going into the office and seeing people looking at the wall, sort of shaking their fists and arguing that numbers were all wrong. We had their attention, right? And yes, there was some problems with the data, but it was your data, so you had to fix it. So that took 2, 3, 4 months to work itself through the system. So a little bit of gamification is certainly a good thing, right? But you can take it so far with purpose. You're going to come up against things that individual teams aren't able to have an impact on. And that's where you need to give some help, right? So lots of help was made available, but it wasn't a one-size-fits-all. But there were some things, common blockers, that people and individual teams couldn't have an effect on their own. These are things you have to treat enterprise-wide. As I said before, one of those was IT controls. Like any regulated environment, any bank, HSBC has controls to mitigate the risks. And in IT, there are things like cyber, data, resilience, all the usual sorts of things, right? You have to have controls around. And we were structured in a very traditional way. The control owner, and I happen to be a control owner for two of them, generally made the control as difficult as possible. So if you managed to pass the test, they knew you were safe. But the control owner didn't typically have any accountability for how efficient the control was. And on the other side of the thing, you have the developers who were confronted often with difficult and complex controls to navigate. Sometimes they found a way around it. Sometimes they just did it and complained. It wasn't a particularly happy place. But we looked at the data, and back in 2019, we were doing about 500,000 change requests in HSBC on an annual basis, and about 40% of those were a simple software change. Right, it's about 200,000 tickets, and in a simple software change, there's only 4 controls, right, at a level 1, at a high level, and they were things like deployment, cyber, identity and access management, and SDLC, right? And the average user journey, the average developer journey through these 4 controls took 30 days of elapsed time and 5 days of work, 5 days of toil. That's not development work, that's sort of project management work, dealing with the different handoffs between the different entities. A lot of these controls were based, assuming or even insisting upon a waterfall way of working. So we have to find a way to break this down. We came up with an idea of controls as products, right? So we built a tight feedback loop between the control owner and the people working at the coalface. Stewardship had to replace the concept of operating in an ivory tower. We automated things that were where we could. We also educated the teams in the pods so that they were able to execute some of these controls themselves, and we were able to independently validate those results. So what that meant, we went from a average lifetime of our user journey of 30 days with 5 days of toil to essentially 0 for the whole thing. It was entirely automated, and the data that it was produced near real time, right? Prior to this, this took 18 months, by the way. It wasn't kind of done 5 minutes. Prior to this, if you wanted to know your controls compliance, typically an audit would come in. They do a paper-based audit, and they'd say, "What changes did you do 6 months ago? Prove to me that you were compliant." So your data really wasn't live. It was very old. But because of the automation we were putting in place, we now had near real-time data. So the decisions we were making were database decisions. And so the control owners and the compliance guardians found this, they now had much better control, right? They had higher levels of compliance because it was visible earlier. Risk could be identified earlier. So the developers were winners and the control owners were winners. And there's 35,000 days of toil and 7.5 centuries of wait time walked out of the organization on a permanent basis after we'd done that. So we moved on to do this for the entire enterprise. You can see that there's a similar graph beginning to appear. In 2022, I think we'd gotten that break happening. I love the quote from Peter Drucker, right? That strategy is breakfast. You can spend loads of money, and people do, and you can have all the plans that you like, but unless you win the hearts and minds of the enterprise that you're trying to change, you're not going to affect change, and you're going to have a much poorer outcome. So had we not put the needs of the engineer at the center of our transformation, I don't think that we'd have had the same successes that we'd seen. So you can see the same type of positive jaws is emerging for this group too. Many of you might be familiar with this. It's the curve of diffusion. It tries or seeks to tell how an idea or a product becomes diffused in a social network, right, or a social system. And 50,000 engineers are certainly a social system. It came into being around communications, I think, originally, but it could be applied to anything, selling sneakers or bread or whatever. And you can apply the same ideas here to HSBC. The early group, the innovators, they were going to innovate anyway. No matter what we were doing or whether it was a transformation program, they're the troublemakers. They were going to try and change things anyway. But because they did the things that they did and they proved what we could do, even with all the headwinds we had at HSBC, it meant that for the early adopters, they were given permission. They now knew what they could do and what they were expected to do. So they were able to adopt pretty quickly, right? Well, I say quickly, over the next year or two, right? The early majority are the really interesting one. That's where you put the expectation out there around doubling half. It was super important to us looking back on it to create that purpose, right? To create that demand. If you think about the controls that I talked about a moment ago, we were able to manage doing 500,000 controls a year, right? With the control mechanism that we had in place, or 500,000 changes a year. But we were telling people to double in half, right? I don't know what the number is now because it don't work anymore, but I left, it was about 4 or 5 million changes a year. There was no way, unless you hired loads and loads of extra people, that you could maintain the same system. So we created that problem, if you like. So that early majority, they got the help, but they also had the expectation that they had to move on. So the time you get to the late majority, the dynamic has changed, right? The language has changed. It's not about you can't do this here. It's not possible. There's all these difficulties about work at HSBC because so many people have already done it. And the language changes to, well, if everyone else has done it, well, why can't you? Then you have to start explaining yourself rather than just offering a simple explanation. And again, this has evolved over several years. So if you remember those groups of 20 or 30 or 40 applications that a sub-department lead might own, there might have been some that they'd left on the shelf for a couple of years. I'm not going to go near those. Business aren't into it, legacy, what have you. But the culture changes in that group. The IT organization themselves, they expect to be moving at pace. They expect the benefits that come with being able to do DevOps change. And the businesses get used to it as well. So by the time you get to year 2, 3, and 4 of this, the expectation for the legacy systems has shifted dramatically from where it was at the start. What were the outcomes then for HSBC as a whole? Well, cost efficiency. There was several million, tens of millions of dollars removed permanently. And when we'd gone to the board to seek permission the first time to do this, because you need a little bit of money to do this, you also need permission because you're going to change the way that you operate. When we spoke to the board, you have to speak in their language. So we talked about reducing cost, and we talked about reducing risk, and we also talked about being able to support an agile business an awful lot better. And kind of as a giveaway at the end, we said we're also going to improve the engineering experience. And they're as human as any rest of us, but the thing that keeps them awake at night, and I'm sure they cared about the engineering experience, but the thing that keeps them awake at night is dollars and risk, right? How much can I save off the cost of operations, and how much can I reduce the risk? And that was how we got our permission. But it's pretty hard to motivate an engineer around cost reduction. It can feel a little bit distant, and if it's not distant, it can feel a little bit threatening, right? And so to turn it into something that they feel ownership of, and that purpose was incredibly important. So the second thing and the third thing kind of talk to that. So the cost efficiency, we got that, the tens of millions of dollars of save. The competitive advantages and moving faster, this notion of the production deployments for a 10-person team per year. When we started this for the investment bank, it was about 60. So a team of 10 would do about 60 releases a year. That was the average. That's over 600 now. So it's 10x from about 2016, 17 to now. If you looked at the broader bank, right, the entire enterprise, it was about 60 as well on an average when we picked that up in 2019, 2020. And it's just over 200 now. So it's trebled in that space of time. We don't have a good number for the engineers, the happiness, right? I'd love to be able to say it was 6 and now it's 7 and it's better. But I can tell a quick story maybe that illustrates, I think, the change that we were able to see. Every 6 months or so, internally for these big programs, there's a TV, internal TV broadcast, and people are invited to attend. So everybody from IT will get an invite, and there'll be some lecture or some talk about some aspect of the transformation that's going on. And there was one for another sister program towards that was happening, and 74 people turned up out of the 50,000 people who were invited. And that wasn't a terrible result. That was kind of typical, we did a talk on the new strategy. We put a DevSecOps strategy together for the bank, and we implemented that. It's a very dry topic, but 11,000 people turned up to listen to that. 11,000 people had to register. It wasn't being counted, nobody was checking it. But I can only think that they turned up because there's something in it for them, right? And at that point, I think we felt we'd won the hearts and minds. So look, there's lots of other things that go into a transformation like this, and in 30 minutes I haven't got the time to tell them all. Some of them are here, you know, getting the strategy right, getting the tooling right. You'll hear lots at this conference, I'm sure, about all the great tools that are out there, and even some of the process improvements are out there. But never forget, I think the people are the secret sauce, right? If you don't bring the people with you, you're not going to have an enduring change, right? It's much harder to stay, particularly in a larger enterprise. So at Calitii, we put that at the center of what we do. We want to partner with people, but we know the change has got to come from within. It's got to be SME led. That's it, okay? Thank you all very much. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them now or after I get kicked off the stage. I don't know how it works here. But I'll be around in the foyer for the next few hours. Thank you all so much. I hope there was something useful there for you all.